10, I'm divided by hand of the bill, money down, I'm divided by hand of the bill, 20, I'm divided by 20, 30, I'm divided by 40, I'm divided by 40, 50, 5, 40, 5, 50, I'm divided by 45, I'm divided by 40, 5 of the bill, 40, 45, now 5 of the 45 of the bill, 5, 40, 45, I got 5, 40, but 5, I'm divided by the bill, 5 of the bill, 5, 45, 5, 50, 5, 55, 5 of the 55 of the bill, 5, 55, 5, 50, but 5, I got 5, 50, now 5, 5 of the 55 of the bill, 5 of the 55, 60, I'm divided by, let's get it down here, now 5, 5, 65, 65 of the bill, 5 of the 65 of the bill, I got 5, 60, but 5, I'm divided by the bill, 5 of the 65, I'm divided by the bill, 5, 60, but 5, total, 5, 60, 109 on 5, 109 on 4, 4, 4, 4, 109, 4. Oh, they're awful good now. They got a wean on them. 75 days, they'll be steered up, and they'll be the kind. 460 now 5. I'm divided to bill 460. 5 of the bill money. I got 65. I'm divided to bill 70. I'm divided to bill 5 of the bill 475. 84. Hit a bill. Hit a bill. Hit a bill now 72 and a half. 5 4 8 77 80. Now hit a bill. Hit a bill 2 and a half. 82 and a half. I'm divided to bill 25. 85 of the bill. 87 out of the bill. 7 out of the bill. 87 out of the bill. 85 out of the bill. 7 out of the bill. I got 45 750. I'm divided to bill 7 out of the bill. 45 out of the bill. 7 out of the bill. 85 485. 487 and a half. I'm divided to bill 7 out of the bill. 485 7 that's total. 485. 485. 392 on 5. 392 on 5. $425 $30. How about $420? How about $100? I got a man. How about $25 $35 down 40. How about $45 to bill 50 down here. 5 over divided bill 48 55 to bill. I got 55 60. How about $100 down here? 5 to bill 70. How about $100 down to bill 5 to bill 475 80. How about $80 to bill 5 to bill 90. How about $100 down to bill 95 to bill $5. How about $5 to bill 505. I got $5 250. How about $5 to bill 2 down to bill. How about $5 to bill 2 down to bill 5 to bill 2 down to bill 5 to bill 2 down to bill. Sold $5 $831. $5 $831. 460 now 5. I'm divided by 460. Divided by bill. I'm divided by 460.
All right, guys. Hey, where's the friend playoffs? Ready to hear it? Yep. 3 weeks high. 3 weeks from now, we'll go get demonstrated. We're talking about the pop.
460, $5, $700, money down. I'm divided by 7 out of the bill. I'm divided by 7 out of the 70. I'm divided by 2 out of the bill. 5 out of the bill. 470. I'm divided by 7 80 now. 2 out of the 82 to 5, 85, 87, 90, 492 and a half. I'm divided by 2 to 5, 495, 97 out of the bill. 97, $5, 2 and a half. I'm divided by 250 now. 5, 5 and a half, 5, 7 and a half. I'm divided by 10. I'm divided by 10, 12 and a half, 5, 12 and a half, 15. 5 and a half, 15 out of the bill. 5, 15 down, 15, 17 out of the bill. 5 and a half, 17 out of the bill. 5, 15, 17, 15 out of the bill. Out of the bill, 70 out of the bill, now 20, 520, give 18, down to 18 out of the bill, 570 out of the bill, 18 at 18 at 18 at 18 at 18 at 18. So 517.50, 392 on 5, 392 on 5. $4 now 5, out of the phone of the bill, 250, out of the phone of the bill, 2 out of the bill, out of the phone of the bill, 10 out of the bill, out of the phone of the bill, 2 out of the bill, 5, hit 5, out of the bill, 7 out of the bill, 10 out of the bill, 4, 10, 4, 10, 4, 10, now 10, you're out of the bill, 12 and a half, out 15, out of the bill, out of the bill, 17 out of the bill, 20 out of the bill, 2 out of the bill, 14, 25 out of the bill, 425 to 5 at 7 and a half, 427 and a half, $425, $750, out of the bill, 7 out of the bill, out of the bill, 25 out of the bill, 7 out of the bill, so the cattle, 425, 300 on 1, 300 on 1 at 425. 450, 5, 7 and a half, I'm divided by 60, 492 and a half, total, 490, 831, 490, 831. 435, 40, 100, 130, 120, 40, 130, 100, 7 out of the bill, out of the bill, 7 out of the bill, 37, 40, 100, 140, 2 out of the bill, 5, 45, 7 out of the bill, 450, 100, 100, 7 out of the bill, 52 out of the bill, 40, 25, 100 out of the bill, 57 out of the bill, 55 out of the bill, 7 out of the bill, 2 out of the bill, 5 out of the bill, 65 out of the bill, 67 out of the bill, 70, and 2 and a half, and 5, 477 out of 80, 100, 40 out of the bill, 2 out of the bill, 5 out of the bill, 87 out of the bill, 90 out of the bill, 2 out of the bill, 92 out of 5, 495, 97 now, 7 out of the bill, 495, 7 out of the bill, 495, 750, so 495, 160 on 4, 160 on 4. $5 down 10, I'm divided by 10 of the bill. I can 5 at 10, I'm divided by 10, 20, 30, I'm divided by 30, 40, I'm divided by 10, 40, 30, 40, I'm divided by 40 bill. I got 40, 50, I'm divided by 10, 55, 50, I'm divided by 45, 5, 45 of the bill. I got 5 over 10, 40, but 5 of the bill, 5 over 10, 45, 5, 50 now, 5 over 55, 60 now, 5 75, 70, 65, 70, 105, 60, 110, 65, 70, total 565, 160 on 3. Hey, we changed gears, guys. Going to work for Byron Holloman over there at Jamestown. $4 now, 5. I'm going to hold it up.
875.
It was 565. We need to over 100 above the head of the bill, 100 above the head of the bill, 100 over 25 of money, 30. I get forward 25 and 7 and a half, 100 and 7 and 30, 100 above the head of the bill, 200 above 5, 100 above 30, 100 above 37, 40, 100 above 40 bill, 200 above 5, 100 above 45, 7 and a half, and 50, 100 over down to the 100 above 5, 50, 100 above 7, 100 above 57, 16, 100 over about 460, 50, 60, 200 above 5, 60, 7 and a half, 470, 100 above 2, 100 above 70, 100 above 7, 100 above 80, 100 over 100 above 2, 100 above 5, 85, 7 and a half, 90, 100 over 92, 100 above 5, 100 over 95 bill, 95, 7 and a half, and $7 and a half now, $5, 100 bill, 5, 5, 2 and a half, 5, 2 and a 5, 5 bill, 7 and a half, and 10, 100 bill, 7 amount, 10 amount, 10 bill, 10 and 10, 10, 10 amount, 10 amount, 10 bill, 7 and 10, so 507, 15, 300, 15, 315. 370, bid 5, 100 bill, 470, 75, my fault, 475 bill, I got 470, 95, 100 bill, 580, 100 bill, 100 bill, 45, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, 85, around here now, buy now, buy. Sold 480, 280 on 1, 280 on 1. 420, bid 5, 100 bill, 100 bill, 100 bill, money down, 100 bill, 29, 5, and 30, 100 bill, 35, 35, 40, 100 bill, down to 100 bill, 48, 45, 7, 50 down here, 450, 47 and a half down, 50, 100 down to 100 bill, 50, 100 bill, 100 bill, 50, 100 bill, 50, 100 bill, 10, 100 bill, 7, and 60, 100 more to go down here, to 100 bill, 5, 7, 70, 100 bill, 5, 7, 80, down to 100 bill, 85, 85, 7 and a half, 87, 100 bill, 7, 90, 100 bill, 9 bill, 2 and a half, 100 bill, 2 and a 5, 495, 100 bill, 5 bill, 48, 90, 10, 100 bill, 5 bill, 2 and a 5, so 492, 50, 831, 831.
Hey guys, we're spraying birds for 60 days, 2 rounds, and they will be castrated. I'm guaranteeing to be serious. Selling this for free. About 520.
520, 530, 100 on the bill, 100 bill, I'm being down, 130, 40, 100, 40, 100, 100, get around here now, 75, 80, 100, 75. I got 575, 100, 75 to the bill, 100, 580, 100, 75, 80, 100, 75, 80, 85, 75, 80, 85, 85 to the bill, 585, 590, 100, 585, 75, 100, 585, 790, 100, 2 and a half. I got 590, $10, 100, 92 and a half. So 590, 500 on 4, 590, 500 on 4.
440.
They're here and here, boys. 540, 550. I got 540, 50, 100, 40, 50 down. Oh. You never know. 445, 7 and a half. 440, 50 down here, got to down, 50, 60 down here, got to down. 460, 2 and a half, 2 and a half, 460, 60, 70, 100, 500, 70, 470, 475, 80, 85, 85, 90, 100, 90, 90, 100, $5, 100, 7 and a half, 49, 7, $5, 5, 2 and a half, 500, 500, 7, 5, 12 and a half, 5, 10, 12 and a half, 500, down here, 5 down now, 511, 512, 513, 514, 15, 100, 14, 514, 15. Sold 514. 300 on 15. 300 on 15. How much? Got an idea. Ain't heard it though. 350, 5, 7 and a half, 100, what's that out of the bill? Put it back. 355, $700. I got 55, 7 and a half, 60. How about I come down here? 57 bucks, come down here. Let's get down here. Let's get down here. 360. 57 bucks, come down here. 60. Sold 357 and a half, 300 on 2. 300 on 2. $5, $10, how about $5, I got 5, 10, I got $5, I got 5, 10, 20, how about 10, 20, I got 5, 10, 20, how about 10, 20, 10, 20, 10, 20, how about 5, 10, 5, 20, sold him 5, 10, 186, 5, 10, 186. Hey boys, I'm gonna put it right here now, put it right here now, put it right here now. 450, 460. I'm gonna go down, cut it down here now, hold it down, cut it down here now. 450, 60, a little green lad. 450, 460. All right, a little green steer. I'm gonna go down, get money down. I'm gonna go down, cut it down here now. 460, 50, 60. I'm gonna go down, cut it down here now. Hold it, 60, 70, 80, 90, 97, 96. I'm down 5 to 9, 5, 10. 5, 10, I'm down 10, 20. I'm gonna go down 10, 20, 10, 20, 30. I'm gonna go down 5, 30, 5, 5, 20, 30, 40, 5, 50. I'm gonna go 40, 50. I got 545, 50, 100, 50, so about 541, 86, 541, 86. 445, 7, half, 100, set out of the bill. 440, now 5, 100, hold the bill, 100 the bill, 100, hold the bill, 100 the bill, 100 the bill, 100 the bill, 50, 100, hold the bill, down here, now 5, 40, 60, around here, now 5, the bill, 70, now 5, 100, 75, 85, 85, 85, 90, 90, 100, 85, 90, so 485, 831, 485, 831.
Hey guys, I don't have a blue dog in an eye. At least one right here, guys. So it matters. 450.
450, 460, how many over the nine come down here? 50, 60, how many over the nine come down here? 55, hold it, put it down, 5, 35, 40, put it down, 450, 5, bill, how many over the nine, 5, bill, 5, how many over the nine, 5, bill, 40, put it down, 5, bill, $4, now 5, money down, how many over the nine, 5, bill, 10, how many over the bill, 15, now 15, now 15, now 20, how many over 20, 25, 30, now 5, 40, 40, how many over the bill, 5, bill, 40, 45, 50. 50, 450, now 5, 55 to the bill, now 60. How about it get it down here now, 460? Jim, 455, both Jims are out. 45, 60, 49, 55, 60. So 455, 112 straight, 112 straight.
I might get a blue eye in this deal. Might get that way. 475.
Hey, 475, 80. How about it get the bill? I get 475, how about half pound, 8,000, how about 5 to the bill, number 9, so 950, 109, 950, 109-1. $600 now, half, 600 half of the bill, 600 money, half, out of half, 700 bill, half, 7 of 8, 800 now, half, 9, 900 bill, not half, $1. It found 975, found 975, about 9 half, 75 of the bill, 950, now 75, found $1, 5 quarter, 100 quarter, 10 half, 10 half, 75 of the bill, 75, 1100, 11 and a quarter, 100 quarter, half, 75, 11, 75 of the bill, 11, 75, 1200 now quarter, 12 half, 75, 100, 75, 13 quarter, 113 quarter, bill, 1300 now quarter, 113 about 25 of the bill, 1300 now quarter, so 1300, 1091, 1091. Hey, so that one, how about it right here now, but right here, 950, 975. I got a man, how about 975 player, how about 75 down, now quarter, how about quarter, how about 10 quarter, 10 quarter, 10 and a half, 75, 1100 down quarter, 11 and a half, 75, 1175, 1091, 1091.
All right, guys, hey, what's the value? 45 days here, shots of 75 on the 50 shot. Right here. 317, about 650.
50, 60, how about it about to cut it down here now, 650, 60, how about 850 now, 60, 650 gone, 60, 70, 670, 670, 670, 80, how about it about 90, how about it down to the bill, 685, how about it about 685, 90, how about it about 600 out of the bill, 690, 85, 90, 85 to 90, how about 85 to 1 out of the bill, 85 to 1 out of the bill, 685 to 1 out of the bill, 685 to 90, but 90 to 90, 685 to 1 out of the bill, 685, 90. So 685, 155, 685, 1 on 3, 155, 3, 155, 3. Oh, 600 now 10, 610. I'm gonna go down here and hand the bill. 610. I'm gonna hand the bill. My man, 610. I'm gonna hand the bill. 610. I'm gonna hand the bill. 610. Hand the bill. And 20. I'm gonna go down 20, 30, 630. I'm gonna hand the bill. Hand the bill. 630. I'm gonna hand the bill. 30, 40. I'm gonna go down 40, 50. 640, 650. I'm gonna hold 50. 650 down here. 50, 60, 660. Both out. 650 now 60. 650 now 60 down here now. 650 now 66. I'll take 55. 60. 665. 665, 665 of the bill, 660 now, 555, 665 of the bill, 665 of the bill.